I finished my FDL-02. Let's talk impressions and overall thoughts on the build process and how it works. Alright, so overall impressions of the FDL-02. First off, just overall, they're really good. It's a very well done kit. It is very well engineered. Everything came together really well. All of the problems that I had with it, I believe, are almost entirely self-inflicted because of the surface finish that I did on this. So to give you an idea, the surface finish on this was 120, 220 grit dry sand, followed by a 400, 1000 grit wet sand to knock down the initial striations, then a coat or two coats of XTC 3D by Smooth-On, which is a 3D print finishing coat, and then another 220 dry sand followed by 400, 1000 wet sand, and then a coat of clear gloss top coat. So lots of surface prep went into this, pretty much everywhere except this stock point. This stock point I left completely raw, so as to not upset the tolerances on it, because I knew they would be pretty tight and I didn't want to mess that up, because the surface finish does change tolerances a little bit, so I was careful not to put it on abutting faces. So like the underside of these mounting plates are still raw 3D print. I didn't even sand them, all of that. Other than that though, then I finished it with a wipe down of just automotive car polish. So if you see any white residue, that's just from the car polish not totally wiping off. I go at it when I notice it with a toothbrush and it comes right off. So if you see any little white residue, like particularly up on the motor cage that has a lot of little nooks and crannies, it's just hard to get it all out. But yes, so this is the FDL-02. I had to order a new pack for it because the packs I had wouldn't fit. You need kind of a long, skinny pack, and all I had was kind of a fat, wide one that was a little shorter, meant for like strifes. And the pack I used was actually for my Hyperfire integration, so it's a pretty wide, thick pack. Didn't fit in here, but this thing can actually fit. Like, I think I have a 1.3 amp hour in here, so 1300 milliamp hour. So pretty sizable. Definitely would last you a good long while running on everything. So going ahead, you can see that it does indeed turn on. It does indeed fire, and it is quite fantastic. So overall thoughts. The big things that I had reservations about with this blaster was the lack of a rev trigger. I, being a frequent nerfer, grew to expect a rev trigger, and I'll be honest, I don't really miss it all that much with the FDL. Now, it is a change. I have to relearn. I haven't warred with this yet, so I imagine it will be a little bit of relearning, but because you have the select fire, you know, I don't think I'm as worried about it, because it's a pretty linear thought process to transition to, right? It's a very linear transition. You're going from, you know, whenever you're pulling the trigger, you're in auto fire or whatever, to, because it's burst fire, right? It's every time you pull the trigger, you're going to fire 2 shots. That's just how it's going to work. And so it becomes more of a I want to fire 2 shots, so I'm going to pull the trigger and fire 2 shots. You don't really miss the being able to keep things spun up, because the brushless motors spin up so quick, you barely even notice. In test firing, I can't really notice that first fire, any lag, any appreciable lag on that first fire. Maybe once I get it into a war and start stretching it out to distances, hitting its max distance across, which is probably 50 feet flat minimum. Once I start really stretching it out, I might notice that first shot going a little bit shy, but I haven't noticed it yet, just shooting it around my apartment. But granted, that's a limited test. So overall, I'm pleased. Now, one of the things that I will say is, and this is something that I've talked to Jesse about, particularly with his web app enhancement that he's working on, is being able to control the dwell time. I asked him about it, and he said that there is dwell time in the motor, so that if you, let me turn down the turn down the speed here so that it's a little bit, well, I should turn it up a bit so it's a little bit easier to see. Which, by the way, that's awesome that you can control that. And we'll turn it down to single fire. So if you single fire and then you pull the trigger soon enough, it will just stay revved and fire again. So if you really... You can hear... I'll let it calm down a bit. You can hear how it pretty much stays revved once it's up. Now, what I have asked him to do, what I've asked, is to be able to control that dwell time, like I can, with the knobs with that. Now, the dwell time control would have to be done through his software interface that he's building, but if you could control the dwell time to, say, make the dwell time a half second, or a full second, or even maybe 2 seconds, then when you pull the trigger, right, it would rev up, it would fire a shot snap as fast as possible, but then stay revved for X amount of time, 2,000 milliseconds. And if you pulled the trigger again, it would just shoot immediately and then reset the dwell time. So you basically, the first time you fired, you would be putting it into, you would set the motors to go to their, whatever their max controlled, RPM is, and they would stay there until the dwell time expired, which would reset every time you pulled the trigger. So your first shot might be a little bit low, but then your wheels will stay revved up at full tilt for a lot longer than what they're currently programmed at. I think that would be a great happy medium. I would set my dwell time to probably about a second or two, I would imagine, in order to compensate for the lack of a rev trigger. And if I could do that, I wouldn't have any complaints about it. It would be different, but I would be able to use it essentially just like I do a normal blaster, in part because of the brushless wheels that just spin up so fast. Other than that, overall, it's a little heavy because the stepper motor's pretty heavy, but the heaviness is centered over my hand, so it's not too bad. Particularly once I got a stock on here, it wasn't that bad. What I will say is that the tolerances on this stock adapter could be a little bit better. There's a little bit of stock wobble. So maybe an iteration on the stock is potentially in order. I don't know how much better it could get, but I could say it's 90%. So with a good stock, it's fine. With a with like a Raider stock, it's serviceable. I think there's room for improvement there, but fortunately, because of the design, this plate is just literally just held on with 4 screws. So you could very easily release a revision to this plate and just, buy it as an improvement later on down the line. Other than that, the other thing I've noticed is that when you're aiming down the barrel, even if you have it on a stock, any kind of thing you put on this rail is largely useless unless it's like a flashlight. So this rail looks nice, and it definitely completes the look of the blaster. I wouldn't not want it, if nothing else, for its aesthetics. But in terms of functionality, you're looking at pretty much only a flashlight, which is okay. I mean, optics are arguably more for aesthetics than any functional purpose on a Nerf blaster anyways. So, not missing it, it's fine. One thing I am looking at potentially doing is trying to source some black hardware. I'm going to go to my local hardware store that has a ton of fasteners, like 10,000 fasteners in a room, and hopefully find some matching hardware in black. The silver's fine. It's perfectly serviceable, but I think black accent hardware would look better with my particular color scheme. So that's one thing I'm going to look at doing. Another functional thing that I will say is, one, it fits on a table frickin' perfect with one of these BSUK mag holders. And again, don't mind the white residue. That's from the buffing powder, or buffing compound. It fits Nerf magazines. This is one-handed, so I apologize, and my framing is going to heck. It fits Nerf magazines perfectly. There is almost no play. I mean, there is as much play as in a stock Nerf magwell, if less than. So this thing is awesome. This magazine release button's a little bit hard to actuate. Again, I haven't warred with this yet, so I'm yet to know how much of a detriment this might be in a war. But it's not too bad. You grab and you push up, and then once it releases, you kind of rock your hand. It'll take some getting used to, but it's not bad. So here is a 15-round worker PMag, and as you would expect, It, again, doing this one-handed is tricky. It fits in and fits perfectly. And again, you kind of end up having to push that button and rock it out. The downside is that 20-round Busbys don't fit because of these ridges. They don't line up. There's a little bit of an interference issue with the Busby rounds. They or the Busby magazines. They interfere. I think you can see it right there. The cutout on the inside is just the slightest little bit too far into the mag well. That said, it's not a deal breaker. It fits Nerf magazines so snugly. I run 18 Nerf mags. It's a niggling detail. But if you run Busby 20s as your primary magazine, you won't be able to use them with an FDL, unfortunately. At least with this iteration. Other than that, I'm pleased. I'm very pleased. I think this is awesome. It's an awesome piece of kit. It's a really well-designed, engineered piece. Every single hole, every single piece fit together exactly as intended. All of the screw points were perfectly fine. The mounting plates inside of here fit perfectly. Nothing was out of place. There were really, really nice little details that were just blew me away at every single step, from things like wire hold downs to the way something was placed or positioned. The wire hold downs in particular were really nice. There's a capacitor on the voltmeter that he sourced, and there's a little tiny cutout in the 3D print for it to sit. So I mean, every single care has been taken in designing this thing, and it shows. As I mentioned before in my earlier videos, print quality was solid. I've done a ton of surface prep because I wanted to, not because I had to. I could have taken everything in this box right out of the box and put it together. Build time, all said and done, build time for me was probably about 2 hours. So it was not an extensive build. It was very easy. His build guides are perfectly good. All of my pain was entirely caused by my own surface preparation, which fudged some tolerances in a couple places, and I had to correct. So I had to end up like taking a razor blade to scrape off some of the coating that got in places it shouldn't have. Nothing was the design's fault or Jesse's fault. So everything was self-inflicted, save for one minor issue I had. In mine, the bushing that spaces out the pusher yoke was a little bit long. And what that meant was that it was spacing the screw out just a little bit too much. And so the screw was scraping along the bottom side, along this plane right here of the pusher yoke housing. So if you look on the inside of this, there's a rotating disc that is attached to the stepper motor on one side and the pusher yoke on the other, and that's what pushes your darts in. And that screw that holds the two pieces together, that holds the yoke to the spinner plate, was a little bit too long, and so it was scraping on the bottom of this housing. Figured out what the problem was, took it apart really quick, took that yoke apart. It's 4 pieces, the yoke, the spinner plate, a screw, and the bushing. Took that apart, took some sandpaper to the bushing, sanded it down just a millimeter or two, fit it back on, made sure everything was going great. No problem. Took me 5 minutes to fix. Well, took me 10 minutes to diagnose, and then 5 minutes to fix. So, no big deal there. Everything else seems to be going great. Super happy with this overall. Excited to get this into a war and really run it through and see what it can do. I think Jesse's really done a fantastic job overall with designing this thing and doing great things. I look forward to seeing what more he can do with it, because I think the biggest cool thing about this is that this kit is in a lot of really sensible pieces, so you could take any piece of it out and replace it or change it in some way, and it would fit back into the platform in a very good way. Like, for instance, you could take this handle, if you revised the handle, you could take the handle off, which is maybe the handle is my biggest gripe, is that it's a little large. Not in a bad way, but it's just a little large. and it's because it holds the battery. So for instance, if he made a stock that held the battery, you could get a different handle, a different stock plate, and a stock and just unscrew the parts that you have and screw the new ones in. And maybe that one would have a rev switch. Who knows? All of this is super modular. Nothing here is set in stone. So I'm excited with what this is right now, and I'm even more excited for what this will become as Jesse continues to find new things to do with it, because I'm convinced he will have new things that he can do with this. So super, super excited to see what happens with this kit. Very pleased with it. And yeah, that's pretty much my overview. I am 95 out of 100. Five points in minor gripes that really mean nothing. So, yep. I mean, I guess the cost is kind of a gripe. It's not a cheap blaster. You can find them on his Etsy store though. If you're looking for top tier brushless performance with custom PCB work and select fire, all of that stuff, you cannot find a better product for what this is. I think you'd be hard pressed to build this into a Nerf blaster any better than what this is. So, A+, absolute A+.